The steppe does not announce danger. It stretches outward in silence, flat, endless, indifferent, a land without walls, without cover, without warning. Armies do not simply appear here. They emerge, as if from the horizon itself, already in motion. In the early 13th century, this silence concealed something the princes of Eastern Europe did not yet understand. A new kind of war had begun. It did not rely on fortified cities or seasonal campaigns. It did not pause for negotiation, nor respect distance as a barrier. It moved continuously, relentlessly, guided not by borders, but by opportunity. And by the spring of 1223, that force was already moving west. The first signs were fragments, reports carried by fleeing merchants, rumors passed between steppe tribes, stories of entire armies that did not break formation, of riders who could cross impossible distances, of enemies who did not behave like any known power. To the Rus princes, these accounts sounded exaggerated, perhaps even absurd. They had faced nomads before. For generations, the lands of Kievan Rus had lived with the constant pressure of steppe warfare. The Pecheneg, the Cumans, the Polovtsians, these were known enemies, understood in both strength and limitation. They raided, they withdrew, they negotiated. Their tactics were fluid, but predictable within a familiar pattern. This new force did not fit that pattern. But the Rus princes did not yet know that. Far to the east, the Mongol Empire had already reshaped the world. Under the command of Genghis Khan, its armies had moved with calculated violence across Central Asia, crushing kingdoms that had once seemed permanent. Cities had fallen in sequence. Entire regions had been reorganized under Mongol control. But this campaign toward the west was different. It was not an invasion in the traditional sense. It was a reconnaissance in force, a probing advance led by two of the Mongol Empire's most capable commanders, Subutai and Jebe. Their objective was not to conquer, yet it was to learn, to map terrain, to test responses, to provoke reactions from unknown powers beyond the steppe, and most importantly, to understand how these Western armies would fight. The Mongols moved with deliberate ambiguity. They did not advance as a single overwhelming force. Instead, they fragmented their presence, small detachments, swift movements, unpredictable routes. They struck lightly, withdrew quickly, and allowed information to spread faster than their arrows. Confusion was not a byproduct of their strategy. It was a strategy, and it worked. By the time news reached the Rus principalities, it was already distorted. Some reports described a vast, unstoppable army. Others spoke of scattered bands of raiders. There was no clear consensus, no unified intelligence. And in a political landscape already fractured by rivalry, that uncertainty proved dangerous. The Kievan Rus was not a single state. It was a loose federation of principalities, each ruled by its own prince, each guarding its own interests. Alliances existed, but they were fragile, often temporary, and shaped by immediate need rather than long-term unity. At the center stood Kiev, still symbolically powerful, but no longer dominant in practice. Authority was decentralized, and in moment of crisis, coordination became difficult. When the first direct contact occurred, it was not with the Rus, but with the Cumans. The Cumans, long-time steppe allies and occasional adversaries of the Rus, were the first to encounter the advancing Mongol forces. And unlike the Rus, they immediately understood something was wrong. This enemy did not behave like any they had faced before. Their formations did not scatter under pressure. Their retreats were too controlled. Their attacks came in waves that felt coordinated, even when separated by distance. The Cumans attempted to resist. They failed. Defeated and driven westward, the Cumans carried more than just their losses. They carried urgency. They crossed into Rus territory not as raiders, but as refugees. And with them came a warning that would shape everything that followed. The Cuman leaders approached the Rus princes with a direct appeal. This enemy will not stop with us. If the steppe falls, your land will be next. They did not ask for protection. They asked for alliance. For the Rus princes, this presented both an opportunity and a dilemma. On one hand, the Cumans had long been a source of instability. Supporting them meant strengthening a former adversary. On the other, ignoring their warning carried risk. especially if the threat they described was real. But perhaps more importantly, this was a moment for influence. If the Rus could defeat this unknown force alongside the Cumans, it would reaffirm their control over the steppe frontier. It would demonstrate strength. And in a political system driven by prestige that mattered, the decision once made was decisive. Several principalities agreed to mobilize. Among them were powerful figures, princes who commanded not only troops, but reputations built over years of conflict. But unity was surface deep. There was no single commander, no unified chain of command. Each prince brought his own forces, his own objectives, his own interpretation of the threat. They were allies, but they were not an army. As the coalition formed, the Mongols did not retreat. They adjusted. Subutai and Jeeb had achieved exactly what they intended. They had drawn their enemy out. Now the next phase could begin. The Mongols began to withdraw, not in panic, not in disorder, but with careful control. They moved eastward, maintaining distance, allowing themselves to be seen, but never fully engaged. To the Rus and their Cuman allies, this appeared as confirmation. The enemy was retreating. They were being pushed back. Momentum was shifting. But this perception carried consequences. Because in steppe warfare, pursuit is never neutral. It stretches formations. It separates units. It creates gaps, not only in lines but in communication. And once those gaps appear, they are rarely closed in time. The Rus princes advanced. They followed the withdrawing Mongol forces across the open steppe, moving deeper into unfamiliar territory. The pace varied. Some units pushed ahead aggressively, eager to engage. Others lagged behind, constrained by supply lines or cautious leadership. The coalition began to spread, not visibly at first, but enough for an experienced observer to recognize what was forming. Subutai recognized it immediately. This was not a unified advance. It was a fragmented pursuit, and fragmentation on the steppe is weakness. The Mongols continued to retreat. Days passed, distance increased, and with each mile, the Rus coalition became less coordinated. Commanders lost direct contact with one another. Decisions were made independently, and the shared objective, defeating a common enemy, began to blur under pressure of movement. Still, there was confidence. The enemy had not turned to fight. There had been no decisive engagement, no indication that this force could stand against a coordinated attack. To many of the Rus leaders, the conclusion seemed obvious. They were winning. But this confidence rested on a misunderstanding. Because the Mongols were not avoiding battle. They were shaping it. The terrain ahead offered what they needed. The Kalka River, a natural feature in an otherwise open landscape. A place where movement could be constrained, where positioning could be controlled, where timing could be precise. This was not where the Mongols had been driven. It was where they intended to fight. And as the Rus coalition approached, they did so without fully realizing how far they had already been drawn into the plan. They were no longer advancing on the enemy. They were being led. Behind them, their lines of communication stretched thin. Their formations, once cohesive, had begun to fracture, and ahead of them, just beyond clear visibility, the Mongol army was no longer retreating. It was waiting, not as a scattered force, but as a unified command, disciplined, positioned, prepared. The steppe remained silent, but the nature of the conflict had already changed, and by the time the Rus princes realized it, they were already committed. By the time the Rus coalition reached the Kalka River, the campaign had already begun to slip beyond their control, not through a single failure, but through accumulation, distance, fatigue, misalignment. Each factor, small on its own, had compounded over days of pursuit across the open steppe. And now, at the edge of the Kalka, those hidden fractures were beginning to define the battlefield. The river itself was not imposing. It did not present a natural fortress, nor a clear defensive barrier. Its banks were uneven, its flow inconsistent, more a disruption of movement than a decisive obstacle. But in a landscape defined by openness, even slight interruptions mattered. They slowed formations. They created hesitation. And for an army already struggling to maintain cohesion, that hesitation carried weight. The Rus forces did not arrive together. They arrived in sequence. Advanced elements, primarily led by more aggressive commanders, reached the river first. Behind them, other contingents trailed at varying distances, separated not only by terrain, but by timing. There was no synchronized deployment, no unified line forming across the horizon. Instead, there were clusters of forces, each aware of the others, but not fully connected. Among the leading figures was Mstislav the Bold, an experienced commander known for decisive action and personal courage. He had pushed forward more aggressively than many of his counterparts. His forces, along with allied Cuman cavalry, formed the forward edge of the coalition. From his perspective, the situation still appeared favorable. The enemy had continued to withdraw. No large-scale resistance had materialized, and now, near the river, there were signs that the Mongols might finally be preparing to stand. But what appeared as opportunity was, in reality, timing. The Mongols had calculated the approach precisely. They had allowed the Rus forces to stretch, to separate, to commit without coordination. And now, they began to reverse the dynamic. For the first time in days, the Mongols did not withdraw. They appeared, not as a scattered screen of horsemen, but as a structured presence, visible, deliberate, and positioned just beyond immediate engagement range. It was a subtle shift, but for those watching closely, it marked a change in intent. Still, the Rus advance did not pause. There was no collective halt to reassess the situation, no effort to consolidate before engagement. Each prince retained authority over his own contingent, and with that authority came independent decision-making. Mstislav the Bold chose to attack. The initial engagement began with cavalry, fast-moving units. Primarily Cuman riders alongside Rus elements advanced toward the Mongol line. Their objective was clear: disrupt, test, and if possible, break the enemy before they could fully deploy. At first, the Mongols responded as they had throughout the campaign. They yielded. Their front line absorbed the contact, briefly, and then began to give ground. It was controlled, measured, familiar to the Rus and their allies. It looked like confirmation. The enemy was once again retreating under pressure. And so, the pursuit resumed, this time at the edge of battle. But something had changed. The Mongol withdrawal was no longer about distance. It was about direction. Instead of pulling straight back, they began to angle their movement, subtly guiding the pursuing forces across the terrain. To an untrained eye, it would have appeared as natural evasion, but in practice, it was alignment. They were shaping the axis of advance. Behind the leading Rus elements, the rest of the coalition was still arriving. Some units had not yet crossed the river. Others were only beginning to deploy. Communication between contingents was limited, carried by riders, delayed by distance, often incomplete by the time it arrived. There was no shared awareness of the developing engagement, only fragments. And within those fragments, assumptions filled the gaps. The enemy is retreating. The advance is working. Victory is near. These assumptions drove decisions. Mstislav pressed forward. The Cumans followed, and the gap between the vanguard and the rest of the coalition widened. This was the moment Subutai had been waiting for. Not the first clash, not the pursuit, but the point at which the enemy committed without support. The Mongol line, still appearing to withdraw, reached a position of their choosing. The terrain here offered just enough variation: low rises, open space, and controlled visibility. It was not dramatic, but it was sufficient, because the effectiveness of what followed did not depend on terrain alone. It depended on timing. Without warning, the Mongol retreat stopped. What had been a fluid withdrawal hardened into formation. Units that had been pulling back began to pivot. Flanks extended outward. Rear elements advanced. And for the first time since the campaign began, the Mongols initiated a full, coordinated counterattack. The shift was immediate, and for the Rus vanguard, disorienting. The pursuing cavalry, already extended and moving at speed, suddenly found themselves facing a unified line. Arrows began to fall, not in scattered volleys, but in sustained, disciplined fire. The distance closed rapidly, but the conditions had changed. The Mongols were no longer retreating. They were advancing. Horse archers moved in coordinated arcs. maintaining distance while delivering continuous fire. Their movements were synchronized, not as individual fighters, but as components of a larger system. They did not charge directly into contact. They shaped it. The Rus and Kuman cavalry attempted to respond. Some pressed forward, seeking to break through the Mongol line before it fully stabilized. Others began to slow, reacting to the sudden increase in resistance. But without unified command, their reactions were inconsistent. And inconsistency in that moment was enough. The Mongols exploited it immediately. Their flanks, already extended, began to curve inward, not abruptly, not as a visible encirclement, but gradually, tightening the space in which the Rus vanguard could maneuver. At the same time, additional Mongol units, previously unseen, entered the engagement. They had not been part of the initial withdrawal. They had been held back, positioned, waiting. Now, they moved to close the structure. For the Rus forces at the front, the battlefield began to compress. Movement became restricted, visibility decreased, and the flow of the fight shifted from pursuit to containment. Behind them, the rest of the coalition was still not fully engaged. Some units, hearing the sound of battle, accelerated their advance. Others remained uncertain, lacking clear information about what was happening ahead. There was no coordinated reinforcement, only staggered arrival. And as each new contingent approached, they encountered a battlefield already in motion, not one they could shape, but one they were forced to enter on its terms. The psychological effect was immediate. What had begun as a confident advance now felt unstable. The enemy was not breaking. They were adapting, faster than expected, with greater coordination than anticipated. Still, withdrawal was not immediate. For many of the Rus commanders, the instinct was to hold, to stabilize, to push through, because the retreat, in that moment, required a level of coordination that no longer existed. And so, the engagement deepened. The Mongols maintained pressure without overcommitting. Their arrows disrupted formations. Their movements limited escape routes. And their command structure, centralized, disciplined, responsive, allowed them to adjust continuously as the battle evolved. The Rus coalition, by contrast, was reacting. Each prince, each contingent, making decisions based on local conditions. There was no unified response to the changing battlefield, only parallel efforts to survive within it. And within that fragmentation, the outcome was already beginning to take shape, not as a sudden collapse, but as a gradual loss of control. The trap had not closed all at once. It had been built over distance, reinforced through movement, and now at the Kalka River it was tightening layer by layer. The Rus princes had not been defeated yet, but they were no longer directing the battle. They were inside it, and the structure surrounding them was no longer theirs. By the time the full shape of the battlefield became visible, it was already too late to correct it. The Rus coalition had not suffered a single decisive blow. There had been no catastrophic charge, no moment where the line visibly shattered. Instead, something more subtle and more dangerous had taken hold. They had lost the ability to act together. At the front, Mstislav the Bold and the forward elements were now fully engaged, pressed by a force that no longer yielded. The Mongol formations continued to adjust, shifting pressure from one point to another, never allowing the Rus cavalry to stabilize. Arrows fell with measured consistency, not in chaotic bursts, but in controlled sequences, each volley designed to disrupt movement, to force hesitation, to create space. And in that space, the Mongols maneuvered. Attempts to break through the Mongol line began to fail. Charges that might have succeeded against a less disciplined enemy now met resistance that did not collapse under impact. The Mongols did not absorb force. They redirected it. Units that appeared exposed would withdraw just enough to draw attackers forward, while others moved to strike from the sides. It was not a static defense. It was a moving structure. Gradually, the Rus vanguard began to fragment, not all at once, but piece by piece. Small groups became isolated. Command signals were lost in the noise and distance. And the battlefield, once open, began to feel constrained. Behind them, the situation was no better. Reinforcements arrived in stages, entering a fight they did not fully understand. Some attempted to push forward aggressively, believing they could reinforce the front. Others slowed, sensing disorder ahead. But without clear coordination, their actions overlapped without reinforcing each other. They added weight, but not cohesion. The princes, those who had commanded the coalition, were executed, not through open combat, not in battle, but as a demonstration. Accounts describe a method that was deliberate and symbolic. The captured princes were placed beneath wooden platforms, and above them, Mongol leaders held a victory feast. The weight, literal, sustained, became the instrument of death. It was not a chaotic act. It was controlled, purposeful, a message for the surviving soldiers. The outcome varied. Some were executed, others were dispersed. Few returned. The battlefield at the Kalka River did not end with a final charge. It ended with silence. The Mongols did not pursue further into Rus territory. Not immediately. Their objective had been achieved. They had tested the Western armies, observed their command structures, identified their weaknesses. They had learned that the Rus princes could be drawn into pursuit, that their coalitions lacked unified command. That coordination broke down under pressure, and most importantly, that a retreat, if controlled carefully enough, could become a weapon. The Battle of the Kalka River was not a conquest. It was a lesson, one that would be remembered years later when the Mongols returned, because when they came again, it would not be as a probing force. It would be as an empire, and the weaknesses revealed at the Kalka would not be corrected in time. Cities would fall, principalities would collapse, and the structure that had once defined the Kievan Rus would not survive the second encounter. But all of that began here, not with a siege, not with an invasion, but with a pursuit across an open steppe where the enemy never truly fled. They only waited, and when the moment came, they turned,